The Galactic University of Xenobiology prided itself on being the foremost institution for understanding primitive species across 17 star systems. Their crown jewel, the Department of Terran Studies, where the galaxy's brightest minds gathered to decode the mysteries of humanity with all the confidence of a food critic reviewing a restaurant they'd never actually visited. Professor Zeltharos, a being whose 6 arms allowed him to gesture dramatically while simultaneously taking notes, adjusting his translator, and stroking what passed for his chin, had spent 3 centuries perfecting his understanding of human behavior. His credentials were impeccable: 14 published papers on the curious case of human pack dynamics, a widely cited thesis on bipedal locomotion and its psychological implications, and a best-selling textbook titled Humans: A Species Guide for the Perplexed. Never mind that his closest encounter with an actual human had been watching grainy surveillance footage from a trade station buffer zone. The lecture hall that morning buzzed with the kind of academic energy that only comes from beings who believe they've figured out the universe's most confounding puzzle. Tall, crystalline Vorthax sat in the front rows, their prismatic heads refracting light as they took meticulous notes. Behind him, the gelatinous Blorthians rippled with anticipation, while a cluster of insectoid Chitauri clicked their mandibles in what passed for scholarly enthusiasm. Each species had sent their finest minds to unlock the secrets of the galaxy's most bewildering civilization. "Today, my esteemed colleagues," Professor Zeltharos announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "we begin our comprehensive examination of Homo sapiens, arguably the most paradoxical species to achieve spaceflight without first achieving basic logical reasoning." The students leaned forward. This was why they'd traveled light years and paid exorbitant tuition fees. This was cutting-edge xenoanthropology at its finest. As detailed in Chapter 3 of your required reading, the professor continued, activating a holographic display that showed what appeared to be humans engaging in something called competitive sitting on furniture. Humans exhibit a fascinating tendency toward ritualistic furniture worship. Notice how they gather in circular formations around elevated platforms, demonstrating clear hierarchical submission to their wooden and metallic overlords. A Vorthax student raised what might charitably be called a hand. "Professor, the caption indicates this is something called musical chair. Could this perhaps be related to their documented obsession with acoustic vibrations?" "Excellent observation, Prism Singer Yixita. Indeed, humans appear to believe that certain arrangements of sound waves possess mystical properties capable of compelling physical movement. We'll explore this primitive shamanism in greater detail next week." The class murmured appreciatively. This was exactly the kind of insight they'd come for. That's when the administrative assistant burst through the door, her bureaucratic composure cracking like poorly maintained hull plate. Administrative assistant Quendera belonged to a species known for their unflappable demeanor and their ability to navigate academic red tape with the grace of a master diplomat. Seeing her rattled was roughly equivalent to watching a star suddenly decide to collapse into a black hole on a Tuesday. "Professor," she wheezed, her breathing apparatus working overtime, "we have a situation." Professor Zeltharos paused mid-gesture, 3 of his arms freezing while the other 3 continued taking notes out of habit. "What kind of situation? Did the provost finally approve our budget request for more holographic humans?" "No, sir. We have an actual human here, enrolled in your class." The lecture hall fell silent except for the gentle humming of life support systems and the sound of Blorthian students slowly deflating in surprise. Professor Zeltharos processed this information with all the grace of a quantum computer trying to divide by 0. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? I thought you said we have an actual human." "That's correct, sir. Apparently there was a mix-up in the exchange student program. The paperwork was filed under Observational Studies of Advanced Species, but due to a clerical error involving 3 different translation matrices and what I can only describe as cosmic irony, the human was accepted into our program instead of the other way around." One of the Chitauri students began clicking excitedly. "Does this mean we get to observe human behavior in real time? This is unprecedented. We could revolutionize the field." Professor Zeltharos felt what humans might recognize as a cold sweat, though his species expressed anxiety through a shift in gravitational field manipulation. "Where is this human now?" Apparently they've been waiting for 47 minutes because they didn't want to interrupt your lecture." They seem remarkably polite for a member of such an allegedly chaotic species. The professor straightened his academic robes, a ceremonial garment that had cost him more credits than a small starship, but made him feel appropriately scholarly. Well then, I suppose we should invite our subject inside. This could actually be quite beneficial for our studies, a living specimen to observe and catalogue. What Professor Zaltharos didn't realize, as he prepared to welcome what he assumed would be a fascinating but ultimately predictable research subject, was that he was about to discover the fundamental difference between studying something from the outside and having that something study you right back. The galaxy's premier expert on human behavior was about to learn that textbooks, no matter how thoroughly researched and peer-reviewed, had one significant limitation. They weren't written by humans. As administrative assistant Quendera went to fetch their unexpected student, Professor Zaltharos couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed academic world was about to experience what humans might call a reality check. Though, given his current understanding of human terminology, he probably would have classified it as some sort of primitive banking ritual. The door opened and education was about to become a mutual exchange in ways the good professor never anticipated. The human who walked through the door looked disappointingly normal, which was itself deeply disappointing to a classroom full of beings who had expected either a savage warrior or a primitive mystic, possibly both. Instead, they got someone wearing what appeared to be standard intergalactic student attire, carrying a datapad, and sporting the kind of apologetic smile that suggested they were genuinely sorry for existing in the same space as everyone else. "Hi. Sorry I'm late," the human said, their voice carrying none of the guttural roars or ritualistic chanting that the textbooks had led everyone to expect. "Traffic was a nightmare getting here from the dorms, and I couldn't figure out if I needed a parking permit for my shuttle or if the campus transport system accepts Earth credits, which it doesn't, by the way, learned that the hard way." Professor Zaltharos blinked all 6 of his eyes in sequence, a nervous habit he'd developed during particularly challenging dissertation defenses. "Please, take a seat. We were just beginning our examination of human social hierarchies as expressed through furniture-based ritual." The human glanced at the holographic display, which still showed the musical chairs footage, and their eyebrows performed a subtle dance that somehow conveyed more information than 3 pages of academic analysis. "Oh, musical chairs. Yeah, that's just a party game, usually played by kids at birthday parties when the adults run out of ways to tire them out before cake time." Dead silence fell across the lecture hall like a neutron bomb of awkwardness. Professor Zaltharos felt his carefully constructed worldview developing stress fractures. "I'm sorry, did you say party game? Yeah, you know, like fun, entertainment. The point is to eliminate players until there's one person left, but mostly it's an excuse to play music and watch 7-year-olds panic about seating arrangement. Though honestly, it's kind of a terrible game because someone always ends up crying, and there's inevitably that one kid who takes it way too seriously and ruins the whole vibe." A Vorthak student's crystalline structure began resonating with what could only be described as academic distress, but the ritualistic significance, the hierarchical dominance displays, the primitive worship of elevated surfaces. The human tilted their head, another gesture that somehow managed to be both polite and devastating. "I mean, chairs are pretty great. They hold you up when you're tired, but I wouldn't say we worship them. That would be weird even by human standards, and our standards include people who collect vintage lunchboxes and argue about whether pineapple belongs on pizza." Professor Zaltharos felt compelled to reassert his expertise before his entire curriculum collapsed like a poorly designed space station. "Perhaps we should move on to more complex behavior. Class, please turn to Chapter 7, where we examine the human tendency toward organized violence as a form of entertainment, specifically their gladiatorial combat rituals known as sporting events." The holographic display shifted to show what appeared to be humans engaged in ritualistic warfare, involving a spherical object and goals positioned at opposite ends of a field. The accompanying academic commentary described it as evidence of humanity's barely contained bloodlust and territorial imperatives. "Oh, soccer," the human exclaimed with genuine enthusiasm. "I actually played in high school, made varsity my junior year, though I spent most of my time on the bench because apparently tactical awareness doesn't compensate for runs like a 3-legged gazelle with inner ear problems, according to my coach." The Blothian students began rippling with confusion. One of them managed to form enough vocal structure to ask, "But the violence?
The territorial conquest? The ritualistic claiming of enemy territory? Well, I mean, it can get pretty competitive, the human admitted. And yeah, people get really into it, but it's mostly just running around trying to kick a ball into a net. The real violence happens in the stands when someone spills beer on someone else's lucky jersey, or when two fans get into an argument about offside rules. Actually, come to think of it, the offside rule is probably more complex than most interstellar navigation protocols. Professor Zeltharos scrambled to regain control of his narrative. Surely you can't deny the primitive nature of your species' communication method. Our research clearly indicates that humans rely primarily on crude vocalizations supplemented by erratic limb movements. You mean talking with our hands? The human asked, unconsciously demonstrating the very behavior under discussion. Yeah. Some people are more expressive than others. My aunt could probably conduct a full orchestra with the gestures she uses to tell you about her grocery shopping trip. But it's not primitive, it's just emphatic. Helps get the point across, you know? A Chitari student clicked nervous. But your linguistic systems lack the sophisticated harmonic frequencies we've documented in advanced species. How do you convey complex emotional and philosophical concepts? The human's expression shifted into what their textbooks had classified as aggressive bearing of dental structures, but which was apparently something called a grin. Well, we've got poetry, literature, music, interpretive dance if you're feeling fancy. We've got people who can make you cry with a 3-minute song about a truck, and others who can spend 4 hours explaining why their favorite sports team's recent trade was either brilliant or the worst decision in the history of organized athletics. Pretty sure we've got the emotional range covered. Professor Zeltharos realized with growing horror that every confident assertion in his syllabus was being casually dismantled by someone who wasn't even trying to be difficult. The human was just answering questions, and somehow their answers made more sense than 3 centuries of careful academic research. The worst part, the other students were starting to take notes on what the human was saying instead of what he was teaching. This, he reflected with the kind of dawning dread usually reserved for discovering your life support system had been installed backwards, was going to be a very long semester.
3 weeks into what Professor Zeltharos had optimistically labeled advanced human studies, technological limitations and cognitive boundaries, the good professor was beginning to suspect that the universe had developed a sense of humor specifically designed to torment xenobiology. Academics. His carefully scheduled curriculum lay in ruins. His textbooks had become inadvertent comedy material, and his students had developed the disturbing habit of fact-checking everything he said by simply asking their human classmate. The human, meanwhile, had settled into university life with the kind of casual adaptability that made Professor Zeltharos question whether humans were actually the primitive species. His research suggested, or if perhaps his research had been conducted by individuals with the observational skills of a particularly dim asteroid. Today's lecture was supposed to cover the fundamental impossibility of human space travel beyond their solar system, a topic Professor Zeltharos had chosen specifically because it seemed bulletproof. After all, humans had only achieved faster-than-light travel within the past few decades, and according to every reputable source, they'd done so through a combination of luck, borrowed alien technology, and what could only be described as criminal negligence toward basic safety protocols. As we can clearly observe, Professor Zeltharos began, his confidence artificially inflated by 3 cups of synthetic caffeine and sheer academic stubbornness. Humans lack the sophisticated understanding of quantum mechanics necessary for true interstellar civilization. Their primitive approach to faster-than-light travel relies entirely on technology they've reverse-engineered from superior species. The human raised their hand with the kind of polite patience that somehow managed to be more devastating than outright contradiction. Professor Zeltharos had learned to fear that particular gesture. Actually, the human said, and Professor Zeltharos felt his soul leave his body and apply for transfer to another dimension. We developed our FTL drive independent. The quantum tunneling principles were worked out by a physicist named Dr. Chen about 15 years before we made first contact. The math was actually inspired by her kid's bubble-making toy, and a late-night revelation involving too much coffee and a documentary about quantum entanglement. A Vorthak student practically sang with crystalline confusion. But our sources indicate that human science is largely based on crude trial-and-error methodologies lacking theoretical sophistication. Well, yeah, sometimes the human admitted cheerfully. Doc Chen's breakthrough came from watching soap bubbles pop and wondering if space-time might work similarly under certain conditions. She was technically procrastinating on grading midterm exams at the time, but that's kind of how human science works. We get curious about weird stuff, poke at it until something interesting happens, then figure out why it worked afterward. Professor Zaltharos felt his academic credibility developing structural damage. Surely you're exaggerate. No advanced civilization develops interstellar travel through procrastination and soap bubbles. Oh, you'd be surprised what we've discovered by accident, the human replied with the devastating casualness of someone discussing the weather. Penicillin came from moldy bread that a researcher forgot to clean up. Microwave ovens were invented when a guy working on radar noticed the chocolate bar in his pocket melted. Post-it notes were the result of a failed super strong adhesive that turned out to be just sticky enough to be useful but not so sticky that you couldn't remove it. The Blorthian students began rippling with what their species expressed as existential crisis. One of them managed to form vocal structures long enough to ask, "Are you suggesting that your species' greatest discoveries are the result of mistakes?" Not mistakes exactly, more like happy accident. We're really good at noticing when something unexpected happens and then getting curious about why. It's like the entire species has collective ADHD but in a productive way. A Chitari student clicked frantically. But this contradicts everything we know about proper scientific methodology. Where is the careful planning, the systematic approach, the peer review process? The human's expression shifted into what Professor Zaltharos was beginning to recognize as their "oh boy, here we go" face. Oh, we have all that stuff too. It's just that our best discoveries usually start with someone going, "Huh, that's weird," and then spending the next 5 years figuring out why it's weird and whether the weirdness can be weaponized, commercialized, or turned into a better way to make sandwiches. Professor Zaltharos decided to make one last desperate stand for his expertise. Perhaps we should examine human computational limitation. Our analysis clearly shows that human brains are incapable of processing the complex calculations required for modern technology, necessitating reliance on artificial intelligence systems. Sure, we use computers, the human agreed. Math is hard, and honestly most of us would rather spend our brain power on more interesting things, but it's not because we can't do the calculations, it's because we don't want to. Why spend 3 hours working out orbital mechanics by hand when you can build a computer to do it in 3 seconds, leaving you free to argue about whether hot dogs are sandwiches or contemplate the philosophical implications of the fact that we named our planet Earth, but most of it is covered in water. The classroom fell silent except for the sound of several species simultaneously questioning everything they thought they knew about intelligence, civilization, and the proper way to categorize cylindrical food items. A Vorthek student's crystalline structure began resonating with academic panic. But if humans are capable of such sophisticated reasoning, why do your entertainment media consistently portray your species as illogical and prone to emotional decision-making? The human laughed, a sound that their textbooks had classified as a territorial display but which seemed remarkably non-threatening in person. Because emotional decision-making is interesting. Nobody wants to watch a movie about someone carefully weighing all available options and making the statistically optimal choice. We want drama, conflict, people doing stupid things for love or revenge or because they're trying to prove a point. Logic is useful, but it's not exactly thrilling entertainment. Professor Zaltharos realized with mounting horror that his students were not only taking notes on the human's explanations, but were beginning to nod in understanding. Worse, they were asking follow-up questions directed at the human rather than at him. "So human irrationality is performative?" asked a Chitari student. "Sometimes," the human replied, "and sometimes we're just tired, and make bad decisions because we haven't had enough coffee or because we're worried about our bills or because we're trying to impress someone we like. We're not actually irrational, we're just complicated. Most of our illogical behavior makes perfect sense if you understand what we're actually trying to accomplish." Professor Zaltharos watched 3 centuries of careful academic research crumble like a sandcastle at high tide. His textbooks were wrong. His theories were incomplete. His entire understanding of humanity had been built on observations made by people who had never actually talked to a human. And the worst part, his students were learning more in 1 semester of casual conversation than he had managed to teach them in years of formal lecture. As the class period ended, and students gathered around the human to ask more questions, Professor Zaltharos sat alone at his podium, contemplating the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps,
The most advanced way to study a species might be to actually ask them about themselves. It was a revolutionary concept that would probably get him tenure. By the 6th week of the semester, the Galactic University of Xenobiology's Department of Terran Studies had undergone what could only be described as a complete paradigm shift, though Professor Zeltaros preferred to think of it as an extended period of academic recalibration. The official course catalog still listed him as the instructor, but in practice, the human had become what educational theorists might call an organic teaching assistant, and what Professor Zeltaros privately thought of as the reason I drink fermented algae extract before breakfast. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process, like watching a star slowly collapse into a black hole, except instead of cosmic destruction, it involved alien students abandoning their assigned readings in favor of asking increasingly specific questions about human behavior that their textbooks couldn't answer. "Professor," announced Crystalline Singer Vixander, Borthek student whose prismatic head was currently refracting light in what their species considered an expression of academic excitement, "I've been corresponding with human researchers through the Galactic Academic Network, and they've sent me 17 papers on quantum consciousness that directly contradict Chapter 12 of our required reading." Professor Zeltaros felt what he was becoming uncomfortably familiar with, the sensation of his life's work being gently but thoroughly demolished by actual fact. "I'm sure there's been some sort of translation error, actually," the human interjected with their now familiar tone of helpful devastation. "Quantum consciousness is pretty controversial even among humans. Half the physicists think it's legitimate science, the other half think it's philosophy dressed up in lab coats, and there's a small but vocal minority who insist it proves we're all living in a simulation. We haven't figured it out yet, but we're having fun arguing about it." A Blothian student rippled with what passed for intellectual curiosity among their species. "But if humans haven't resolved these fundamental questions about consciousness, how did your species develop artificial intelligence systems?" The human's expression shifted into what Professor Zeltaros had learned to recognize as their "oh, this is going to be complicated" face. "Well, funny story about that. We kind of built AI systems before we really understood how our own brains work. It's like building a car engine. When you've never seen the inside of a car, you know it needs to make things go forward, and you fiddle with it until it does, but you're not entirely sure why it works. That seems inadvisable," clicked a Chitari student. "Yeah, probably," the human agreed cheerfully. "We've got entire committees of people whose job is to worry about whether our AI systems are going to become self-aware and decide we're inconvenient. It's actually a pretty popular career path, existential risk assessment. Though to be fair, we've been worried about our technology becoming too smart for our own good since we invented fire and immediately started wondering if it was going to burn down the forest." Professor Zeltaros made one last desperate attempt to reassert some semblance of academic authority. "Surely your species must have some systematic approach to these complex technological and philosophical challenges." "Oh, absolutely," the human replied. "We form committees, hold conferences, publish papers, peer review everything to death, and then usually end up doing whatever seems like it might work while hoping we don't accidentally break the universe. It's a very sophisticated process of organized improvisation." At this point, administrative assistant Quendara burst through the door with the kind of bureaucratic panic usually reserved for audits or funding cuts. "Professor, we have a situation. The provost wants to see you. Immediately." Something about unprecedented academic irregularities and curriculum deviation beyond acceptable parameters. Professor Zeltaros felt his gravitational field fluctuate with academic anxiety. "What kind of irregularity?" "Well, sir, it appears that your class has achieved the highest student satisfaction ratings in the university's history. Students are requesting additional sections. We've got a waiting list 3 semesters long, and the Department of Comparative Civilization Studies is demanding to know why their enrollment has dropped by 40% as students transfer into Terran studies." The human looked genuinely surprised. "Wait, people actually want to take more classes about humans? That's weird. I mean, we're interesting, but we're not that interesting. Most of us can't even figure out what to have for lunch without consulting at least 2 other people and a random number generator." "That's exactly what," exclaimed Prism Singer Yixtal, their crystalline structure practically singing with enthusiasm. "Every answer you give generates 17 new questions. It's like your entire species is a walking contradiction that somehow manages to function anyway." Professor Zeltaros realized that he was witnessing something that would probably be written about in academic journals for centuries to come. the complete reversal of traditional xenobiological pedagogy. Instead of studying a species from the outside, his students were learning by directly engaging with a member of that species, and instead of confirming existing theories, they were discovering that reality was infinitely more complex and interesting than any textbook could capture. "Professor," said a Blothian student whose gelatinous form was rippling with what might have been excitement, "I've been thinking about human contradictions, and I have a hypothesis. What if the contradictions aren't bugs, but features? What if the reason humans are successful is because they can hold multiple conflicting ideas simultaneously and choose whichever one is most useful in the moment?" The human's eyebrows performed their subtle information-conveying dance. "Cognitive flexibility? Yeah, that's probably part of it. We're really good at changing our minds when we get new information, even if it means admitting we were wrong about something, though we're also really good at stubbornly sticking to obviously wrong ideas when we've gotten emotionally attached to them, so it balances." Professor Zeltaros felt a strange sensation that he eventually identified as intellectual humility. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "our approach to xenobiological studies has been incomplete." "Oh, definitely," the human agreed with devastating cheerfulness. "But that's okay. Incomplete understanding is just the starting point for better questions. The goal isn't to figure everything out immediately, it's to keep getting curious about stuff and building on what you already know. Science is basically just organized curiosity with better record keep." 3 hours later, Professor Zeltaros found himself in the provost's office, expecting disciplinary action and possibly career termination. Instead, he received a promotion, a research grant, and a mandate to completely restructure the Department of Terran Studies around what the university was calling interactive xenobiological pedagogy. "Congratulations, Professor," the provost said, their species equivalent of a smile somehow managing to be both encouraging and slightly terrifying. "You've revolutionized the field of xenobiology by proving that the best way to study a species is to actually collaborate with them." "Who would have thought?" Professor Zeltaros walked back to his office in a daze, contemplating the irony of receiving academic recognition for having his expertise thoroughly dismantled by an undergraduate student who considered hot dog classification a legitimate philosophical debate. 6 months later, the Galactic University of Xenobiology had become the premier destination for interactive species studies, with exchange programs, collaborative research initiatives, and what they carefully termed subject-integrated learning experiences. Professor Zeltaros found himself co-authoring papers with the human student who had accidentally destroyed his curriculum, and discovering that academic collaboration was significantly more rewarding than academic authority. The final irony, he reflected while reviewing applications from dozens of species, wanting to study humans through direct interaction, was that he had spent 3 centuries trying to understand humanity from the outside, only to discover that the most profound insights came from simply asking humans to explain themselves. It turned out that the most advanced species in the galaxy were the ones humble enough to admit they didn't know everything, curious enough to keep asking questions, and wise enough to realize that the best teachers are often the subjects you're trying to understand. Who knew that wisdom could be so thoroughly disguised as casual conversation about sandwich classification?